welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the SEC and Big Ten and some plans that they had if the CFP agreement was not met. And then we will get to Reggie Bush. He actually got his Heisman Trophy back yesterday. Wanted to break down my thoughts about that and just kind of the legacy that he left behind. Then we'll get into my first round mock draft. And I will be honest, this is not an easy thing to do. I do not envy Todd McShay or Mel Kiper, the guys that have to do this year round, because it is incredibly tough to put this thing together. But then finally we will get to a Hot Take Thursday, talking a little bit about the draft and a couple of the guys that I think are going to be taken in the first 5 picks and kind of how I expect them to progress throughout their NFL careers. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your questions on the screen, get noticed, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a little bit of a conversation with me here, ask a question you were wondering about, bring up something that I had forgotten about possibly. So definitely use that if you need to, gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, because there was some news that came out recently over the week. I feel like this week has been pretty active in the world of college football, especially in terms of the kind of the behind-the-scenes world. So one of the big things that came out was when we were talking about those college football playoff discussions and everything that was going on with that and how the SEC and the Big Ten were garnering more and more power in those discussions, I think one of the things that was always kind of under the surface of all of that, and I talked about it a couple of times on here, but I think everything that the SEC and the Big Ten were doing was very calculated for one reason in particular. They had backup plans, and I thought that for quite some time, but it's been confirmed by Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti that they had plenty of backup plans, but they were fully ready to break off from the CFP and become their own entity, become their own governing power. I mean, it's one of those things that I felt like everyone kind of had an idea that this was a possibility, but it seems like they had pretty much their ducks in a row. Ross Dellinger has been the guy that's kind of been at the forefront of this, done some great reporting on it. And Greg Sankey was very, very clear. If the agreement was not met, the one that gives the SEC and the Big Ten 58% of the revenue, combined between the two of them, 58% of the revenue for the upcoming college football playoff discussion, and I think starting in 2026, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's definitely something that they held all of the cards, essentially, because if those two wanted to walk away, or if everyone else wanted to walk away, Notre Dame and all the other conferences, they could have just, said peace out, go and start their own thing and become pretty much college football. There was a real reality where there was so much building around these two conferences that if they were to break off and become their own thing, obviously people would still be watching some other programs out there, and they should, obviously. But at the end of the day, there would be a lot of money, a lot of attention, a lot of TV time. Everything would be put towards those two conferences, and especially if they were able to snap up a couple of teams on their way out, I think it would have been even more aggressive. So very glad that this didn't happen. I think this would have been a very, very intense thing to happen in college football, and would have put us in a very different spot than we are right now, right? We're talking about the Super League. We're talking about possibly Charlie Baker's different idea for a subdivision that teams can opt in or opt out of. That would all be essentially up in flames if the SEC and the Big Ten decided to break off, because the reality is it would have left pretty much everyone else to fend for themselves, and there would have been some different structure for everyone else, but a lot of the energy around college football would have been put towards this new quote-unquote Super League with the SEC and the Big Ten if this were to happen. Now, one of the things that I didn't really know at the time, but definitely have become aware of throughout the last, couple of months as these discussions have become more serious is when they were talking about this expansion. Obviously, this has gone on for quite some time. They've wanted to expand for a number of years, pretty much right when they started, they wanted to expand, but there were different discussions on what that number would be, and they ranged all the way back to, probably pre-COVID. But in January 2022, there was a big moment in all of these discussions, and apparently the SEC and the Big Ten were doing their thing where they, make the argument that they are the most powerful entities in the sport. They're the ones that kind of stir the drink, as it were, and I think it got a little heated, apparently. And I think that was kind of a turning point because some of the other commissioners, some of the other people representing the other conferences in these discussions decided to leave. So they got up and left in the middle of the discussion. And I don't think that sat too well with Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti. And I think they immediately saw what the need for them was and saw that, they're going to be able to garner this amount of power, and even if teams, decide to get up and leave, doesn't necessarily affect them too much, right? They still have the ability to break off and become their own thing and become a quote-unquote super league, and I think that moment was kind of when it all fully clicked for them. Obviously, they've known for quite some time that they sit kind of on a different tier in college football than the rest of the conferences, but there's that moment where you refuse, or you start kind of you stop, I suppose is the best way to put it. You stop kind of worrying about everyone else. You start worrying about yourself, and that's kind of been what's been encouraged over the last couple of years. But especially in that particular moment, they said, okay, well, if you guys, don't want to have any type of conversation, we'll just take over the entire thing. So I think that's when discussions really began for the SEC and the Big Ten in terms of, what is the plan after all of this happens? What's the plan if they continue to walk out of these meetings? Because at a certain point, we do have to make a move. If you're Tony Petitti or you're Greg Sankey, you absolutely had to do something in the next couple of years and, keep up with the times or put your conferences in better positions going forward. And I think it's something that when that outburst happened, when everyone left that meeting and the SEC and the Big Ten were left kind of sitting there, I think they saw it as kind of an opening almost. I think there was this thought for a while that the SEC and the Big Ten would try to not necessarily protect other conferences, but at least keep them around in the party with them. But I think once that happened, they were more than happy to kick everyone to the curb and become their own thing. So I think that's one of the big things that Greg Sankey has said in a number of different interviews. And apparently after the discussions ended where the SEC and the Big Ten got 58% of the revenue and pretty much dominated that entire discussion, there were a number of people that kind of came up to him and basically asked why he, put them in that position, why he made it so difficult, and why he, some would say, was being a little bit greedy in those discussions. And he said, you walked away from the deal. So it's kind of this idea that the second that they decided to leave those meetings in January 2022, the fate was kind of sealed for the other conferences. And that's not necessarily to say that those conferences should feel bad about that, because I understand there's a ton of frustration with the way that the SEC and the Big Ten have kind of handled this new power struggle, I suppose, in the college football world. But I do think there is a certain level of foresight that you have to have in these type of situations. The SEC and the Big Ten were only going to get more powerful, and this idea of them breaking off to be a part of their own league was not necessarily out of the realm of possibility really ever. So I think it's one of those things that people will, it's not necessarily the greatest way to have to go about business if you are the AAC, or if you're the ACC, or if you're the Pac-12 or the Big 12 or any of these other conferences, but it's kind of the situation that you're in. So I think if they had to go back to that January 2022 meeting, they probably wouldn't have gotten up, to be totally honest, because I think the discussions became a little bit less friendly at that point. And not to say that they were super friendly to begin with, but I do think the SEC and the Big Ten definitely stopped caring necessarily about the other conferences once that happened. But getting into kind of what the future of this kind of looks like, and there's always, a ton of different things happening in college football. But I think when we talk about the new college football playoff discussion, and you talk about the things that were going on in those discussion rooms, there was kind of a David versus Goliath type conversation, which is what, we have kind of talked about here. But I think the SEC and the Big Ten are kind of in a position where they have really no reason to do anything that doesn't benefit them. And I think this kind of brings us back to what the future plans for college football are, where, is it the Super League? Is it this subdivision that kind of you opt in or opt out of and has NIL rules and that type of thing? Whatever it looks like, we know for a fact that these discussions are going to go very much like the CFP ones when, all that, or these last couple of months, there's been this SEC and Big Ten saying, we're going to gobble up as much money, as much power as we possibly can. And if you don't, meet us there, then we'll walk away. And I think that's going to be the same case when you come to the table about the Super League, or when you come to the table about new governance. The SEC and the Big Ten are going to have to be catered to. They're going to have to be a little bit pampered in this discussion, because if they're not, what's to say they wouldn't be doing this same exact thing later on? So there's tons at play here, and I think there's so many different things that have happened over the last couple of years, over the last, couple of decades, really, that have kind of set us up for this point, and the SEC and the Big Ten becoming more and more powerful. But one of the big things that I think created some problems within those discussions, and definitely created this idea in the SEC and the Big Ten's head, is we've been such a kind of divided sport for quite some time, and obviously there is some beauty to having different conferences and regional rivalries and all of that, and I absolutely love that, and we need to keep that a part of the sport, although it's, going away ever very, very fast. But I do think there is this certain idea that has kind of been forming over the last, couple of decades, where it's your conference against everyone else. And I understand it from, a personal standpoint. I get, you want your conference to be the most powerful, you want your conference to be the biggest thing in college football, but it has created a lot of confusion in these discussions, and, different rules in different parts of the country, and conferences competing with each other to make sure that their rules are maybe less restrictive than other conferences. And there's just kind of this power dynamic that is kind of formed, where it's just teams vying, or conferences really just vying for position in the college football world. And it's been going on for quite some time now, but the SEC and the Big Ten are kind of just in the position where, why would we worry about other conferences when for, X amount of years, all it's been about is piling resources, piling money, and doing what's best for you and not what's best for everyone else. So they're kind of put in this situation where the SEC and the Big Ten are doing almost exactly what you should expect them to do. If you were put in this type of situation where you know that the NCAA is not necessarily going to be the greatest governing body in the world. They're not necessarily going to put you first. They're not necessarily going to be the person that, takes care of you. You then have to do that. And in the process of doing that, you kind of have to bury conferences in your path. So thankfully, obviously, they came to a agreement. Obviously, that agreement is not what you want by any means, but I do think this kind of creates this. We already had this dynamic of the SEC and the Big Ten being the big dogs on campus. We already had a ton of, energy and money and everything going in that direction. That's only going to get more aggressive before they get to the next discussion of the future of college football, right? There's the FSU versus ACC, which is a very interesting thing going on right now that has some twists and turns to it. There's Clemson getting in on the party, and depending on how both of those shake out, there's many more teams that could come to the table. So by the time we get to the next discussion, whether it's about the Super League or some other governance in college football, it could be that FSU is a Big Ten team, and so is UNC, and so is Virginia, and Clemson, and Miami, and a couple other teams are SEC teams, and then you're lending even more money in that direction. So I guess my hope for these discussions is the next time we get there, that there isn't this atmosphere, I suppose, in college football where it's your conference against everyone else, and you have to look out for your conference interests above all else. I think one of the big problems in the sport has been that, this idea that worry about your conference, not about the sport or not about the players, and we have to put the emphasis back on the sport. So I'm very glad they came to an agreement. I'm very glad that, the SEC and the Big Ten did not break off, because it would have been absolute turmoil in college football right now if that were to happen. But this is not remotely the end of the SEC and the Big Ten playing their big time trump card of being able to say, we can walk off into the sunset and be more than fine with the amount of money that we're bringing in year over year. So I think this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg, I suppose, in these kind of discussions. I think the SEC and the Big Ten will only see themselves as bigger and bigger entities as time goes on, especially if they're able to add teams. So it feels like it's kind of a bubbling volcano for quite some time in college football, and I think an eruption is coming fairly soon. But at the end of the day, I think the SEC and the Big Ten are not worried about when that happens, because they know they're on very stable footing, and they can kind of take advantage of what eruption ends up coming, pick up some teams, and garner even more power going forward. So this is obviously kind of an idea of just how much power the SEC and the Big Ten have, and where their kind of heads are at in the future discussions, because there's going to be a ton of future discussions about where everyone sits and how to allocate money and how to do all of the things in a new model for college football. And the SEC and the Big Ten are absolutely going to use this as an argument to say, well, it shouldn't just be 58% anymore. It should be 65% or 70% or whatever the number is. So definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. I think this is a taste of probably what's to come with the SEC and the Big Ten, and I would not be surprised if there was a league with the SEC and the Big Ten kind of alone at some point, just because of the power and the money that they would ask for in the next discussions. But we'll get to that as it kind of comes. A lot of stuff will kind of develop with that as time goes on over the next probably year or so. But we'll break that down as we get to it. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, let's talk about Reggie Bush. There is a ton of news around him. He just got his Heisman Trophy back. Want to break down what I think about that and how the NCAA might have actually done something good for the first time and maybe forever. But let's take our first break, and we will be right back with that.